Welcome to Higher Change. We're on chapter 18. We're going to talk about ways to raise awareness. There are multiple ways of becoming more aware or conscious of ourselves and the world around us. We're going to talk about essentially raising our consciousness about ourselves and others. In the process, you will be able to identify ways our awareness becomes blocked. We'll define mindfulness, what that means. We're going to talk about mindfulness-based models of psychotherapy. We'll also describe ways of enhancing our awareness or mindfulness. Then we'll differentiate between Eastern versus Western forms of meditation. We'll describe several ways nature helps increase our mindfulness. And lastly, we'll list ways we can increase our spiritual awareness as well. I'm a Gestalt therapist, and Gestalt therapy talks a lot about awareness or consciousness and the things that block that. Gestalt therapy was an early psychotherapy model that sought to raise awareness of oneself and others. Now, if you recall, Gestalt therapy was in reaction to psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis tended to focus on tended to approach the patient as if they were simply a passive recipient of an expert who diagnosed the patient. Whereas in Gestalt therapy, it's more about a dialogue between equal people and the therapist brings their own self into the process and they use themselves in helping the other person raise awareness. And so the therapist is also a part of that process, and they're developing their own awareness and helping the other person to be more aware of themselves. In Gestalt therapy, I'm not going to go over all these now, but there's many different principles that inform Gestalt therapy. It's humanistic. We talked about that and how it puts emphasis on seeing the good in people. It's also phenomenological in the sense that it focuses on how people make meaning for themselves. And so as a counselor or therapist, we simply just try to understand how they make meaning. So in contrast to psychoanalysis tended to assume that the therapist or the psychologist was the expert and knew everything. Instead, it takes a more humble stance and seeks to understand how the client makes meaning for themselves. It's also existential in the sense that that the client seeks to make sense of the world and tries to find meaning, and also has a sense of power or freedom to choose how they make meaning and purpose in their world. Gestalt is also experiential, meaning it's about looks at how the person is involved in their own experience. And so they use the word organismic self-regulation, meaning how do people get their needs met. It's also dialogical, meaning the therapist brings themselves into it. And it's relational, meaning it looks at how people are nested in multiple relationships and how they're nested in the world around them, that people are not in a vacuum, that they exist as part of a larger field. And lastly, Gestalt therapy is experimental, meaning that they make experiments to find out how people respond to that. So in Gestalt therapy, it's all about raising awareness and it looks at blocks, things that block our awareness. So first of all, we have a contact cycle, and this is about how do humans make contact with the world and get their needs met. So the first step is sensation. First of all, we have to sense ourselves, and that gives us an awareness about our needs. And so we receive senses from the world around us and from ourselves. The senses help inform our decisions and help us to know what we need. So the next step is awareness. So obviously we have to become aware of our senses. And we've been talking about this in our own Higher Change series. We've talked about senses and perception, and then we talked about consciousness. So that's where the awareness comes in. But both of these can be blocked. First of all, we can not feel our senses, and that would be desensitization. If we become desensitized to our sensory information. Or we can also have a block in our awareness, and that would mean that we turn away from the senses and we deflect away from that so that we choose not to be aware of something. The next step in the contact cycle is we become mobilized for action. So if we are aware that we're hungry, for example, then we're going to get ready to do something so we can fulfill our needs and we can satisfy that hunger. So that would be mobilization. The block to this would be introjection, where we tell ourselves we ought not to feel a certain way. And so this is a cognitive process that tells us that we should stuff it and ignore it. Then there's action stage. So obviously, if you feel hunger, you sense the sensory input in your body that says you need food. You become aware of it, and then you become mobilized to get food, and then you get the energy there, and then you take action. So that's the next step, action. The other block is a block to this would be projection, where we take it out on something or we act it out in a different way that doesn't get our needs met. It's displacing it, essentially. The next step is contact, where when we make action, we have contact with something that fulfills that need. So for example, if you're in a relationship and you are lonely or you're missing somebody, then you're going to sense the senses in your body that tells you there's an emotional need, and you become aware of it. And then you mobilize, maybe you'll call somebody up, or you get ready to call them. Then you take action. And then you have contact. And then a block to this would be retroflexion. Then once you have your needs met, then you're satisfied. That is satisfaction. A block to awareness regarding this would be egotism, where this would say you're not allowed to feel happy, and that sort of thing. And then lastly, once you feel you have received satisfaction of your needs, then you withdraw. Obviously, we're not always in contact with everybody at a time, and we're not always eating. You're not always focused on one particular need at a time. At some point, you will withdraw and you go into your other activities. And so withdrawal is a normal part of the contact cycle, and it ends it. The block to this would be confluence, where you feel like you have a need to be enmeshed with this contact, and you have a difficulty in withdrawing. So that would be a block in that sense. So at any point in the contact cycle, we can have a breakdown, and so we can have obstacles in developing an awareness about the world around us. Gestalt therapy borrows concepts from Zen Buddhism, in particular concepts of mindfulness as well as acceptance. So we're going to talk about mindfulness next. Mindfulness is the psychological process of bringing one's attention to experiences occurring in the present moment, which one can develop through the practice of meditation and through other training. Now, it's oftentimes associated with meditation, but meditation is not necessarily required. It's simply about awareness. And so while it's associated with Buddhism, it also is a psychological process. So in Gestalt therapy, it's all about helping people to be aware of the people around them and being aware of themselves in the present moment. It's not about the past. Whereas in psychoanalysis, the focus was on people's past experiences. In Gestalt therapy, it's about how people are present how people are aware of their present moment, and are they aware of what's going on around them. And so that's about consciousness and consciousness of our present. So most mindfulness-based approaches practice radical acceptance, a concept that's drawn from Buddhist thought, but it's also seen in Christianity as well. Basically, it's, if we look at this from a Christian perspective, a lot of times people will say, well, are you simply accepting sin? Or are you accepting the bad parts of ourselves? Well, it's not saying that you endorse sin or you endorse bad behavior. That's not what acceptance is. It's simply just an acknowledgement or awareness of what is. So, for example, if you struggle with something, rather than saying that the struggle is okay, it's just recognizing that's what you have. That's your struggle. And it's the equivalent of forgiving yourself or forgiving others for what's going on, or recognizing that this is the world that we live in. For example, I remember I went to see a Gestalt therapist once in my training, and I was talking about something in my childhood that made me angry. And I wasn't really aware of it, but my fists were clenching and I was getting tight about it. And, the anger was obviously heard in my voice. And the therapist asked me to be aware of my body and just asked me what's going on in my body. And I looked down at my hands clenching and said, no, I don't know why, I mean, it brings up some emotions. And he would say, well, are you angry? I said, no. I tried to brush it off and said, well, what's wrong with being angry anyway, even if you are? And I said, Christians don't get angry. We're not supposed to be angry. And he laughed and he said, ha ha, really? Christians aren't supposed to be angry? And I had to think about that. I never really said that out loud before, but I realized, wow, that's an interesting thought. Where did I get that from? Where did I get the idea from? The reality is that even Jesus Christ got angry. God gets angry. So if God can get angry, then why can't I? Especially when it comes to how you've been mistreated or hurt in the past. And so I had to allow myself to feel the anger. And oftentimes what happens is that people try to repress things because they think it's wrong, but then it comes out in all the wrong ways or passive aggressive ways. And so we're not able to cope with it because we never really fully acknowledged it to begin with. And so it's through accepting something that it allows us to find healing. And that brings us to the paradoxical theory of change. Arnold Basier, psychiatrist, once said, he wrote an article for Gestalt therapy about the paradoxical theory of change. He writes this: change occurs when one becomes what he is, not when he tries to become what he is not. By rejecting the role of change agent, we make meaningful and orderly change possible. So it's through accepting ourselves and accepting what is that we find that healing and change. For example, in Christianity, I think about times when Jesus accepted people and then he asked them to stop sinning. But a lot of times Christians want to put it in the opposite order. We expect people to change before they come to God or before they find healing. The reality is it's through acceptance that we find the healing and we find the help that we need. It's through forgiveness and the grace. It's through grace that we find change. Now, more recent models of psychotherapy also integrate mindfulness, and these include mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Then there's acceptance and commitment therapy. There you see that acceptance again. And there's also dialectical behavioral therapy. And so dialectical behavioral therapy is very similar theoretically to Gestalt therapy. It just has more cognitive components. So mindfulness is oftentimes associated with meditation, but for Christians, meditation is not necessarily about emptying the mind, but it's also about replacing negative thoughts with positive thoughts, particularly about God. So let's talk about some ways we can raise awareness. First, we raise awareness about our bodies. Then we can raise awareness about injustices in the world. We can have awareness about the challenges that we face. Sometimes we ignore those. We also need awareness of our thoughts and feelings, like I talked about anger, but it could be about sadness or anything. So we need to be aware of our thoughts and feelings. We also want to be aware of our blessings. What are we thankful for? We also want to be aware of our food and how would we eat, because that affects our health. We want to be aware of others. We want to be aware of the people around us. We want to be aware of nature and the natural world around us. And lastly, we want to be aware of time. Sometimes we forget to pay attention to time. We're going to talk about each of these more in detail. Let's just break these down. So first of all, we want to be aware of our bodies. Through exercise, we can develop an awareness of our bodies. Unfortunately, it's quite possible for people to push themselves to extremes and ignore their bodies, which cause injuries. So sometimes people are so caught up in something that they enjoyed, but they stop listening to the pain that their body is trying to tell them. So it's important to listen to when our bodies are in pain and practice self-care so you don't hurt yourself. We also want to be aware of injustices. There have been increasing attention to how mindfulness exercises tend to focus on the individual rather than looking at how people are involved in a larger society and how people can respond to the problems around them. For example, woke is an African American application of awareness with regard to social justice and racial justice. It derives from the African American English expression, stay woke. Unfortunately, sometimes white people misunderstand this as an opportunity to be proud of or to brag about how woke they are. But that's not really the intention. It's really simply just to be mindful of injustices, a constant reminder to be mindful of injustices around us. Another thing to be aware of is our challenges. Consciousness is not nor should be about avoiding or ignoring the ugliness of life, but rather about seeing the beauty in it or despite it, and choosing to rise above it. So we are aware of the injustices. We are aware of the challenges, our struggles, the disappointments in life. We're not ignoring that. And sometimes that's what people think. It's being fully conscious of it, but then we decide to do something different. It's also being aware of our thoughts and feelings. So rather than repressing our emotions that we don't like, we accept them. We pay attention to them, allow them to guide us, or at least allow our decisions to be informed by a better understanding of our thoughts and feelings. Some people unfortunately use mindfulness and meditation to avoid feeling and thinking about the pain or hurt in their lives. And this is actually known as spiritual bypass. Some people think that they can just meditate away the challenges and the hurts that they have. That's not the purpose of it. It's simply we want to be aware of these things. We should be. But it's about then rising above it or choosing how to respond differently. Sometimes people think that avoidance of it is going to be helpful. If they just zone out and pretend that it doesn't exist, that kind of thing does not help. An even better method for becoming aware of our thoughts and feelings is oftentimes therapy with a trusted, qualified professional. And the reason why is sometimes outsiders can actually be more attuned to what's going on in us than we can be, because we may not be fully aware of something. We may not be conscious of something that's affecting us, whereas outsiders can actually see objectively sometimes because they don't have an agenda to avoid pain like we do. Another thing we want to be aware of is we want to be appreciative of our blessings. We talked about struggles and challenges, but sometimes people focus only on that. They're only aware of their challenges and struggles. But we also want to be aware of our blessings, things that we are thankful for, because that helps us to have balance as well. We don't want to only focus on the negatives in life. We also want to be aware of the positive things in life as well. We also want to be aware of our food. Sometimes people who rush to finish their food are not paying attention and appreciating the food they eat. That's another kind of blessing. Taking time to be aware of our food. Some people will pray before they eat. They call that grace. And that's a ritual that simply helps people to be mindful of what they eat. An awareness of our food forces us to slow down and allows our bodies to feel satiated faster. So it's not just saying grace. It's also about taking time to pay attention to our taste buds and really enjoy the food that we're eating. And listening to our stomach as it gets full, because sometimes people ignore their stomach when they're full already, or they don't give their stomach a chance to catch up and feel satiated, or they're such in a rush that they don't even take time to enjoy their food. Another method that sometimes people use is fasting. Fasting is a method people use to heighten their sense of awareness about themselves, and it could be about food. But it could be anything that people need to withdraw from. Some people need a fast from their smartphones, for example. Fasting is not for the purpose of dieting. It should only be engaged in when healthy and ideally after consulting medical professionals. But intentionally withdrawing from food, not as an eating disorder. I hope people understand. We're not obsessing about diet or body image here. It's simply just a practice to help us be mindful of how our bodies are attached to things around us. Sometimes fasting can be a powerful way of raising our consciousness and awareness. I've had some of the most spiritual experiences in my life when I was fasting. So something Some people do. But you have to be very careful because sometimes people will take it too far and there's some dangers associated with it. Even in the Bible, there are some examples of fasting. Jesus, for example, fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. Now, that's not something humanly possible. I don't encourage anybody to do this for 40 days. But it's just interesting in the story. Matthew and all the Gospels talk about how Jesus went into the wilderness. So in Matthew 4, it says, "And Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry." Ideally, obviously. And then the tempter came to him. So he faced temptations after that. But it's interesting, Jesus went through this period of mindfulness where he spent time in the wilderness first. So he spent time in nature. We're going to talk about nature as well. And he also spent time withdrawing from food. We don't know how he did that. That is not humanly possible for somebody to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. So who knows? Maybe he was doing like Muslims do with Ramadan, where they have something small after the sun goes down. But anyway, the point is that he practiced a method of fasting. Maybe as others believe it was only supernaturally possible. So maybe that's what maybe he was able to do it through supernatural ability. But it's not something I would recommend humans attempt because it could kill you. But anyway, after this, Luke also says, in a parallel of this, he says, Jesus full of the Holy Spirit. So that in that sense, we believe, Christians believe there's a supernatural thing going on here. So he left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry, and the devil said to him. So it was through the fasting that it helps him to be. It wasn't just through the fasting, it was the Holy Spirit that enabled him. But the fasting was a method that helped to raise awareness, spiritual awareness for himself. And then after that, he was tempted. As we remember from the story, he was tempted to turn stones into bread. He was tempted to jump off the pinnacle of the temple. And lastly, on the top of a tall mountain, Satan told him, "All these things I will give you, the whole world, essentially, if you just fall down and worship me." So Satan tempted him to end this whole controversy right then, if all he had to do is to bow down and worship Satan. And Jesus withstood all of these temptations because he was fully aware of something. And it's interesting, Jesus said it was not by bread alone that man lives, but by the word of mouth. And he quoted scripture. So for him, for Jesus, it was about awareness of scripture that enabled him to withstand these temptations. We'll talk about spiritual awareness and coming up. Another thing that we might want to be aware of is also the animals that contribute to our food. Sometimes people they forget to be mindful of where their food comes from. So in some cultures, like in Judaism and Islam, people practice rituals that to be mindful of how those animals are slaughtered. And so they pray, for example, before they kill the animals. And I think these rituals maybe there's some value to them because in our consumer society today in fast food restaurants, people oftentimes forget to be mindful of the animals that died to make their food. And so something that we can remember. We also want to be aware of people around us, other people. We cannot fully know ourselves if we're not aware of others, because to know ourselves, we have to know ourselves in relationship with others. Also, awareness of others is important for our relationships. If we are not aware of the people around us, we're not paying attention to what's going on in their lives, then we're not going to have effective, good relationships with them. If we want to have good relationships, then we need to be aware of them, not just ourselves. We also want to be aware of nature. This has numerous healing effects. And merely viewing nature is known to speed healing and benefit learning. In Roger Walsh's review of the research on therapeutic benefits, it was found that nature enhances cognitive functioning, attention, and emotional and spiritual well-being, and reduces stress and depression. So nature has a lot of mental health and physical benefits. John Muir, who is well known for his role in bringing awareness to nature, said once, "Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul alike." So he believed that nature was very important to our humanity. And lastly, when we want to be aware of time, sometimes we get so caught up in our busyness that we don't take time to manage our time. We don't take time to be aware of how we use our time. People spend so much time doing things that they don't reset and think about how they're prioritizing their use of time. It's interesting, Jews and Seventh-day Adventists take a sacred time out of their week to practice a Sabbath. The Sabbath is basically another word for rest. And this is known to give people more time to spend in nature and to be present with people around them. It also helps people to develop a greater awareness of their dependencies or their idols. So I encourage my students to take a 24-hour mental rest or media fast. And the reason why is to help people be aware of the things that they're ruminating about, of the idols in their lives, because those things wear on us. And so when we take a break, it gives our mind a chance to take a break. And then we can become aware of people and the natural world around us. And it also helps us to remember to be aware of God or our higher power as well. So in his article on the secular case for a biblical Sabbath, Ethan Blake observed that as we strive daily to fix our inherently broken world in quest for idols and deceptive messiahs, perhaps Shabbat is a true and accessible utopia, neither a perfect nation nor era of peace, but a weekly consciousness that sees infinite gratitude for what really matters in our finite lives. I think that's a perfect summary of the benefit of the Sabbath. It's a weekly consciousness that helps us to remember what is truly important in life. Sometimes we get so caught up in the little things and the trivial things of life that we forget what's really important. We so caught up in paying bills that we forget that at the end of our lives, when all is done and we go to our graves, no one's going to remember us as he paid his bills. They're going to remember us for what's really important, our relationships with people. Another thing he points out is that the Sabbath is useful for raising consciousness because of other things. For example, abstaining from the exchange of money reveals an abundance of the things in life that are free and do not cost money. We oftentimes want to spend, but there's so many things we can do in life that don't require money. He also says abstaining from technology forces us to focus on the here and now. If you're always on your smartphone, then you may forget to pay attention to the people around us. I know my students who are so addicted to their phones, they can't put it down for more than 5 minutes. And that's really sad, because what does it say? If you can't put your phone down for 5 minutes in a class, what are you doing in your relationships? When you're out on a date or spending time with family, can you put your phone down? Can you spend time looking at people's faces and talking to them? Also, abstaining from focusing on time allows one to not focus on time. If we're always following the clock, we're always in a rush, then can we ever truly just stop and be still and be present with people without thinking about what we got to do next? What are we going to do tonight? Can we just enjoy the present moment? Can we be truly present in the present? That's what mindfulness is really about. And I really believe the Sabbath is a great tool for helping people develop their mindfulness. So we've talked about mindfulness, but I also want to talk about meditation, because that's always something we've talked about. It's associated with mindfulness. People use meditation to develop their mindfulness, but there's two types of meditation. I like to think of Eastern and Western types of meditation. Eastern meditation is where people like to concentrate on something and focus on something. However, there's some dangers associated with Eastern meditation that you have to be aware of. First of all, and Heidi Hansen writes an article called "The Potential Psychological Dangers of Meditation," especially relevant for those with PTSD. You can find this at newsynapse.com. So there's three main dangers that Hansen writes about. First, there's dangers of destabilizing effects of prolonged meditation. There's dangers of detachment, as we've talked about. And there's also dangers of attention, the prerequisite of self-regulation. We're going to break each of those down more in detail. First, dangers of destabilizing effects of prolonged meditation. Hansen says that greater self-awareness or attention to emotions can bring up emotional pain from the unconscious to the surface. That's actually not good if you're not ready for it. So some do not have the ego strength to deal with this, especially those who suffer from PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a result of coping systems being overwhelmed. So that's why we talked about other methods that people can deal with trauma without talking about it. But meditation can sometimes bring these traumatic memories to the surface, and if you're not ready for it, that can be damaging or re-traumatizing. So you have to have something that's going to help you. Over the past 40 years, Hansen writes, over the past 40 years, I have met innumerable meditators who have been drained and devitalized by the anti-life attitudes they have internalized and practiced. There are people all across the United States who were involved with meditation in the past and now find that their training is interfering with their ability to bond with a mate, stay in love, find their life's work, make money, and express their individuality. That's an example of what we've said is spiritual bypass or avoidance. People may use meditation as a way to avoid reality, and that's not good. They would argue that it does take courage to continually enter relationships where one could suffer from the results of our natural attachments. And that's okay. It's okay. There's an idea in Buddhism that we're supposed to escape from suffering, but that's not ideal for most people. For most people, we need to embrace suffering, because if we're always escaping and running away from suffering, we're never going to take risks in life, because to love is to suffer. And so if you're going to be in relationships with people, you have to be open to the possibility that they could hurt you. I've seen many people who don't have the resilience. They don't know how to handle relationships because all they know how to do is run from pain. That's not good. You have to know that when you're in a relationship, there is a possibility of pain, but you can handle it. You can deal with it. We can all cope and survive. And because another danger is the dangers of attention. Because increased awareness brings up emotional pain, we have to have the coping mechanisms in place. And mindfulness will not work without a foundation of self-regulation, meaning we have to know how to cope with that pain. That has to be the basis, the foundation, so that when we do go into mindfulness and we are aware of the pain, we know how to deal with it. So what is meditation like in the Bible? We've had Eastern meditation, but there's also Western meditation. In a Christian sense, meditation is about remembering God. If you do a search in the Bible for the word meditate or meditation, you'll discover the biblical understanding of meditation. Isaac was meditating when he met Rebekah. Genesis 24:63 says he went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Meditation is mentioned over a dozen times in the book of Psalms, and it basically means to reflect deeply on God's love. In Psalms 48:9, it says, within your temple, O God, we meditate on your unfailing love. And we meditate on his actions, his creation. And Psalms 143:5 says, I remember the days of long ago. I will meditate on all your works and consider what your hands have done. And also we meditate on God's laws. And the psalmist writes, I meditate on your precepts and consider your ways. Now, the Eastern pantheistic version of meditation, such as found in Buddhism, helps people to become aware of themselves and their surroundings so that they can connect and become one with the universe. In this approach, the mind is emptied and there's no encounter with a personal God. It also teaches us that we do not listen to God's words, but rather simply to just be at peace with quietness and silence. But this endorses the idea that God is an impersonal God who does not seek to dialogue with us. In contrast, a Western or Christian version of meditation does not empty the mind, but rather focuses or reflects on God. We believe that the Word of God is God manifested in humanity so that we can enter into a dialogue with a very personal God. John writes in the beginning of his book about this word, or logos, which is the word logos. The word in Greek is logos. And he writes, in the beginning was the word, that logos, and the word was with God, and the word was God, and the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word entered into humanity to have a personal dialogue with us. Part of being created in God's image means that we have the ability to communicate in a verbal language. So it's this that God asks us to have a dialogue with him. So rather than blanking our minds out, our meditation may be a dialogue or simply listening to the words of God as God speaks to us. So it's more personal, it's more relational. Now, whatever we focus on will influence us. If we elevate our thoughts, it will elevate our spirit. So what is the highest object of our thoughts? If we focus on negatives in life, it will cause us to be depressed and ill. Therefore, what better object to meditate on than the highest of all powers? Ellen White writes this in Testimonies for the Church. She writes, God should be the highest object of our thoughts. Meditating upon him and pleading with him elevates the soul and quickens the affections. A neglect of meditation and prayer will surely result in a declension in religious interest. Religion is not merely an emotion, a feeling. It's a principle which is interwoven with all the daily duties and transactions of life. As I said, it's I can think about many times when I would be so worried about my health or, my problems in life, right? But when I trust and meditate and trust in God and listen to him speaking to me, I hear him saying to me, that God cares about me. That's the messages I hear when I meditate on God's thoughts. So reflecting on how God manifests himself to us in our language may include visualization. Again, some Christians have argued that because visualization has been used in New Age and hypnosis as a way to empty the mind, that it should be avoided. Pastors who instruct their congregants to visualize the cross are sometimes accused of conspiring with outside spiritualistic influences, thus creating a negative atmosphere of fear and suspicion. However, visualization does not have to be used hypnotically either. In fact, many therapists guide clients using visualization without putting them in a trance. Instead, they simply have them imagine a past or hypothetical experience in order to evoke an emotional response that we can then process and deal with. One can even imagine God in front of them and describe what they see. And this has been a powerful healing exercise, as imaginary can be linked to the relationship history. Because we tend to project onto God our experiences, visualization can help people see how the relationship experiences shape their view of others and God. And this can be self-reinforcing. Having seen the healing power that visualization can have, I find it odd that people write it off without any good argument that all forms of visualization are bad. Ellen White recommended that Christians practice visualization. In fact, how can one meditate on the life and death of Jesus without visualizing the cross? She writes, "It would be well for us to spend a thoughtful hour each day in contemplation of the life of Christ. We should take it point by point and let the imagination grasp each scene, especially the closing ones. As we thus dwell upon his great sacrifice for us, our confidence in him will be more constant, our love will be quickened, and we shall be more deeply imbued with his Spirit. If we would be saved at last, we must learn the lesson of penitence and humiliation at the foot of the cross." The Bible encourages us to meditate and consider certain positive things. In Colossians 3:2, the writer says, "Set your mind on things above. Think positively. Think about the good things. Think about heavenly things." And Jesus says in Matthew 6, he says, "Consider the lilies of the field, therefore do not worry about tomorrow." Ellen White expounds on this idea in Desire of Ages. She writes, God desired that they should be led to prayerful study and meditation in regard to Christ's mission. If Joseph and Mary had stayed their minds upon God by meditation and prayer, they would have realized the sacredness of their trust and would not have lost sight of Jesus. If you recall the story of how they lost their son Jesus in the crowds, Ellen White's basically saying, if they kept their mind on sacred things, they would not have lost sight of him. But in the same way, we oftentimes lose sight of God because we don't take time to meditate. Now, many people, she would say, attend religious services and are refreshed and comforted by the Word of God, but through neglect of meditation, watchfulness, and prayer, they lose the blessing and find themselves more destitute than before they received it. So we want to maintain that, and we can do that through meditation, watchfulness, and prayer. However, Christians also see so basically we want to take time to pay attention to God and the sacred things of life. But this doesn't mean that we're avoiding life. Christians see the mindfulness of Buddhism as an escape from or avoidance of true reality, not an engagement with it. While mindfulness tends to promote healing from within, Christians integrate mindful awareness with a spiritual dependence on God for lasting change. They choose to accept the flaws while looking for God's beauty at the same time. While Eastern meditation and mindfulness encourages detachment from the world and negative thoughts that arise, mindful Christians pay attention to faith, hope, and love by attaching oneself to God and the promises of God. So some things we can do to attach ourselves to God are things like meditation, but also spending time in nature. Spending time in nature is a great way to develop a greater connection with God and learning spiritual principles. In Ministry of Healing, Ellen White writes the following. She says, during his ministry, Jesus lived to a great degree an outdoor life. His journeys from place to place were made on foot, and much of his teaching was given in the open air. In training his disciples, he often withdrew from the confusion of the city to the quiet of the fields, as more in harmony with the lessons of simplicity, faith, and self-abnegation he desired to teach them. It was beneath the sheltering trees of the mountainside, but a little distance from the Sea of Galilee, that the 12 were called to the apostolate, and the Sermon on the Mountain was given. So this is a picture of my wife and I on the mountainside in Jordan. It's important to spend time in nature and to take time to reflect on the spiritual lessons around us, because it teaches us about God. And it's also a great way to spend time with people. It's very healing. This is a picture of my friends and I in California as we went on a hike there. Ellen White writes, Christ loved to gather the people about him under the blue heavens, and on some grassy hillside or on the beach beside the lake. Here, surrounded by the works of his own creation, he could turn their thoughts from the artificial to the natural. And that's interesting because artificial is even more prevalent today. But think about, if it was important back then, how much more important is it today for us to get away from the artificial to the natural? So she continues, in the growth and development of nature were revealed the principles of his kingdom. As men should lift their eyes to the hills of God and behold the wonderful works of his hand, they could learn precious lessons of divine truth. In future days, the lessons of the divine teacher would be thus repeated to them by the things of nature. So it's important to take time to really be in nature and listen to the lessons that are taught there. She continues, the mind would be uplifted and the heart would find rest. She also writes, all who are under the training of God need the quiet hour for communion with their own hearts, with nature, and with God. An awareness of nature helps us to learn more about the value of life. Ellen White also writes, when every other voice is hushed, and in quietness we wait before him, the silence of the soul makes more distinct the voice of God. He bids us, be still and know that I am God. Psalms 46:10. So it's good to think about the spiritual lessons that can be taught from observing nature. The natural world has many lessons to teach us. As Christians, we believe that God created the world out of love. And Ellen White describes how nature testifies of his love for us. She writes, "The hillsides and the fields were bright with flowers, and pointing to them in the dewy freshness of the morning, Jesus said, 'Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. The graceful forms and delicate hues of the plants and flowers may be copied by human skill, but what touch can impart life to even one flower or blade of grass?'" It's a reminder that the lilies teach us that life came from somewhere, that we can't create that life by ourselves. It's a reminder then that we all have a purpose. Every wayside blossom owes its being to the same power that set the starry worlds on high. Through all created things thrills one pulse of life from the great heart of God. The flowers of the field are clothed by his hand in richer robes than have ever graced the forms of earthly kings, and these are all natural. It is he who made the flowers and who gave to the sparrow its song, who says, "Consider the lilies, behold the birds." In the loveliness of the things of nature, you may learn more of the wisdom of God than schoolmen know. On the lily's petals, God has written a message for you, written in language that your heart can read only as it unlearns the lessons of distrust and selfishness and corroding care. Why has he given you the singing birds and the gentle blossoms, but from the overflowing love of a father's heart that would brighten and gladden your path of life? He has filled the earth and air and sky with glimpses of beauty to tell you of his loving thought for you. The beauty of all created things is but a gleam from the shining of his glory. If he has lavished such infinite skill upon the things of nature for your happiness and joy, can you doubt that he will give you every needed blessing? Consider the lilies. Every flower that opens its petals to the sunshine obeys the same great laws that guide the stars. And how simple and beautiful and how sweet its life. Through the flowers, God would call our attention to the loveliness of Christ's character. He who has given such beauty to the blossoms desire far more than the soul should be, that the soul shall be clothed with the beauty of the character of Christ. That's where true beauty comes from. It's from that character of Christ. And then finally, nature teaches us the value of life. Upon all created things is seen the impress of the deity. Nature testifies of God. The susceptible mind, brought in contact with the miracle and mystery of the universe, cannot but recognize the working of infinite power. Not by its own inherent energy does the earth produce its bounties, and year by year continues its motion around the sun. An unseen hand guides the planets in their circuits of the heavens. So nature, if we remember all that's going on in nature, it reminds us that there's a power that's in control of this universe. A mysterious life pervades all nature, a life that sustains the unnumbered worlds throughout immensity, that lives in the insect atom which floats in the summer breeze, that wings the flight of the swallow and feeds the young ravens which cry, that brings the bud to blossom and the flower to fruit. The same power that upholds nature is working also in man. The same great laws that guide alike the star and the atom control human life. Why would anybody want us to detract away from paying attention to our world? Why would anybody not want us to be mindful of our world, others, or God? I wonder what the purpose or agenda is of Christians who constantly seek to accuse others of spiritualistic practices, especially when it comes to this subject. It reminds me of what Ellen White wrote about Jesus' teachings. If only people can meditate on this, as this is particularly relevant. Ellen White writes this: "For in commenting upon the actions and motives of another, who can be certain of speaking the exact truth? How often pride, passion, personal resentment color the impression given. A glance, a word, even an intonation of the voice may be vital with falsehood. Even facts may be stated so as to convey a false impression, and whatever is more than truth is of the evil one. Everything that Christians should do should be as transparent as the sunlight. Truth is of God, deception is every one
of his myriad forms of Satan, and whoever in any way departs from the straight line of truth is betraying himself into the power of the wicked one. Yet it is not a light or an easy thing to speak the exact truth. So she's basically reminding us, as we talk about these subjects, we need to be accurate. We need to be fair. Otherwise, we're not doing the work of God. We cannot speak the truth unless we know the truth, and how often preconceived opinions, mental bias, imperfect knowledge, errors of judgment prevent a right understanding of matters which we have to do. We cannot speak the truth unless our minds are continually guided by Him who is truth. And that's where mindfulness comes in. We have to be mindful of truth. Through the Apostle Paul, Christ bids us, let your speech be always with grace. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. In the light of these scriptures, the words of Christ upon the Mount are seen to condemn jesting, trifling, and unchaste conversation. They require that our words should not be only truthful, but pure. And lastly, those who have learned of Christ will have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. In speech as in life, they will be simple, straightforward, and true, for they are preparing for the fellowship of those holy ones in whose mouth was found no guile. So we want to be accurate and honest as we talk about these things. It's only fair, and we cannot really be mindful of God and the world around us if we are deluding ourselves with untruths. I hope you can join us for the next chapter as we talk about how we learn habits in the next chapter. Thank you.